So while that's loading, we're from Exah. So Exah started as mostly as a sales consultancy company. We had to work with sales teams quite a bit, and at some stage we started learning a lesson that no matter how much time you spent with the sales team, as soon as you walked out, about 2 or 3 months later, the old behavior came back. So we knew at that stage that we needed to start instilling a lot of this in systems. And we started with a much smaller system. And the nice thing about the small systems is you can install them simply, but you end up running out of runway quite quickly. So it's at that stage that we decided we need to try and start on a system that we know we're not going to run out of runway on. And that was our first journey with Salesforce. A big focus that we have is often fixing, because we generally don't work with new businesses, existing businesses, and often they've tried to implement some form of CRM and it's failed a lot. CRM has a very high churn ratio compared to especially ERPs. So we wanted to understand why so that we can avoid it happening. So what we know when we start approaching these problems is that accurate diagnosis is half the cure. If I'm giving the wrong reasons for why something's going wrong, it's just going to push me further and further away from where we want to go. So what we try and identify at the start are the symptoms. We know when a CRM is sick, because everybody's so focused on when it goes well, but we need to be able to identify when it's not going as well as it needs to. So if you, and mostly when we start talking about the room, there's quite a few here who are already on Salesforce. If you recognize any of these, then there's some indication that the organization might be a little sick. Patchy data. Your data is not what you need it to be. So sometimes it's a little bit irritating, sometimes it's chronic. We see inaccurate pipeline values. You can't 100% trust the values that are in the pipeline when you see them in the pipeline. We see poor activity tracking. Not everybody's tracking what they're supposed to track, and often that's why you install a CRM. That's initially why a lot of companies approach CRM, as they want to track what their salesmen do. The next one is we see low user adoption. So low user adoption is anything lower than everybody who's supposed to be using it as much as they should. We see incomplete scope. So what that means is the software works well, and that's why there's such a big drive for multi-cloud when you start combining the right sets of software. When you skip a crucial piece of software, or when you start skipping licenses to essential users, you start paying a price after a while. And that's one of the biggest ones that we see. And we see poor integration. Now, poor integration, a lot of guys immediately when we spoke to them afterwards, that is a huge problem. For us, wherever we see Excel, we know there's a problem. Excel happens when systems end. Excel is always the end of a process, and that's one of the biggest reasons that we need to, when we start analyzing these organizations, we hunt for where do people produce Excel. So the effect of all of that, if one wants to ask, so what? Why is that stuff important? If you look at a funnel, the first thing that happens is when these symptoms happen, it has an effect on your ability to render your service and to sell. And basically, it just means that your funnels are leaky. But a leaky funnel isn't just expensive. In some cases, exceptionally expensive. We have some clients who pay up to 5,000 Rand per lead. So they want to be quite sure that when something enters at the top, you're going to deal with it well. The bigger problem is every one of those drops are humans. They're people. You're never happy when you're forced to leave. When you're forced to leave something, oftentimes when you exit a funnel, you don't do it as a happy person. So if we start pushing in more and more marketing, but we still have a leaky funnel, what ends up happening is we're just upsetting a lot more clients. So for us, when we see leaky funnels, we have a very visceral response to that. So one of the key approaches, I'm a big fan of Nicholas Taleb, and at some point he wrote about there's nothing that you can add, no extra process or extra pill that you can take that does as well as just reducing something that does harm. So rather than looking at how can we make sure customer success works, we want to look at how can we make sure we don't make stupid mistakes that affect how these organizations work. So what we look for is, as your project goes on, there will be certain events that lead to the ROI dropping, and at some point it drops below a level where you say, this is not what I signed up for. I was very excited and it didn't end up being what it's supposed to be. So some of the things that we look at is inadequate design. If somebody came in and just dropped the system down or made quick assumptions about your business way too quickly, they didn't take the time to understand your business well enough, that's one of your first problems. There's very few things that can be fixed after you've already done a wrong design. Insufficient scope. So again, as we indicated earlier, there are certain circumstances where you should have bought more licenses than you did. It might either have been because it wasn't explained well enough, or that you didn't push the system wide enough, but often that scope affects the ability for the system to operate. What we say is the same as a car. We like using a car as a systemic example. If you have 90% of a car, I've got everything, but I just took out the carburetor and I took out the fuel line. Is it going to go 90% of the speed? It's not. It's not moving at all. So if you take anything out of your core, it just ends up killing the system. So we're very careful about where that happened, where we skipped on scope. Superfluous development. Now, this is something on Salesforce is a very rich declarative development environment, but there's no system that can't stop somebody from making stupid mistakes on it. Especially in Salesforce, when you start deviating away from the standard objects towards Visual Force way too early, you're just creating a lot of pain for yourself downstream. The most common one we see are organizations that are unable to shift to Lightning because of old legacy Visual Force development that was done. Poor integration. So again, when your system doesn't talk to other systems, we're making trouble, we're making loss. It's there, again, if we see Excel somewhere, we know there's trouble. And for us, sometimes that's sad because it doesn't matter if you say, if we walk into a company and you'll see, especially around the CPQ, they say, but I'm quoting in Excel and I can also do this stuff quickly. You don't have the same view. And view is everything. If you have the data on the system, but you can't view it, it's the same as telling you walk from this side to that side. It's very simple. Close your eyes and try the same thing. The landscape's precisely the same. Nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is your ability to recognize what's happening around you. So you'll see when we start looking at what reps see and how they work, that's such a big factor. Is what can you see and can you trust what you see? Lack of management commitment. Now, everybody's so focused on top management, but middle management is by far the most important factor that affects your Salesforce instance. We've seen that if a manager doesn't bless the process entirely and somebody comes and complains about an activity they need to do, it's almost an open invite at that stage not to execute it because they know they'll get away with it because the manager doesn't like it either. Then we have, sorry, I'm as blind. Poor initial implementation. Now, this is absolutely key. You can't just arrive, again, we'll give 1 or 2 training sessions and walk away. We're still trying to figure out Salesforce. We've been busy with it every day, and we're still figuring out new parts. And we probably say the same thing in 5 years from now. The initial implementation, the initial training sketches certain habits that sustain. So it's either going to be the right habits, or it's going to be the wrong habits. And then the last one, the lack of continuous monitoring and intervention. Now, if you leave somebody for a week to do the wrong habit, immediately, and you'll end up, we'll show you one of the biggest problems there is that your system is not as core to your operations as you think it is. So what we want to do is to be able to monitor every single individual at a very short feedback cycle in order to adjust to stuff fast enough that it doesn't become a bad habit. So if we look at where do we fix this, because a constant theme we see is that where do I start? If I log into the organization, there's just so much stuff to do. And one of the first things that we see is you can't say everything's important. If everything's important, nothing's important. There are certain things we look for when we start analyzing that help us figure out where do we apply a pressure lever that makes a big difference. So this is our in-house blueprinting process. To just explain what it does, it's basically a process flow diagram that follows everything through that a client sees and experiences. We look at the front stage actions that play a role and the backstage actions that play a role. So the detail here is not important. If we look at a specific situation, we zoom in, everybody has processes. And what we look for is where we find, for instance, the question we ask is, if you phone them, a client, the client doesn't answer, what triggers you to phone them back? If somebody says, I'll remember, that's not a process, and we immediately start sketching out room where we see things are going to go wrong. The reason we do that, and this is key about the concept of crucial episodes, is you'll notice in this case, there are large periods where there's a lot happening in the background, but nothing from the client's perspective. So that's just stupid. That's a perfect opportunity for you to see, but if I could see it that way, maybe I should just give them feedback. So to explain why we look at crucial episodes and something that you can relate to, if I ask you, how long are you willing to wait? The answer depends on where you are right now. So if we're sitting in a restaurant and you stand in front of the door, you're going to wait about 10 seconds before you're going to be irritated if nobody helps you. If somebody helps you and you sat down, you have about 2 or 3 minutes before a menu needs to be brought before you really start getting irritated. After the menu is brought, it moves to 5 minutes. After you ordered, it moves to 25. So what we want to see is in this previous chain where there's certain episodes where it was more important to respond quickly than others. Because we can't respond quickly to everything. You can't tell somebody to prioritize and do everything. By definition, prioritizing means that we're leaving certain things out. Another very good example is a problem that they faced that I think it was in the UK, that they needed to invest in making people happier with the subway. So they wanted to look at, are we going to make the trains faster? Are we going to make the seats more comfortable? And the biggest bang for buck that they could ever get was just putting up a timer at the top telling you how long it still is before the next train comes. Because you'd rather wait 7 minutes knowing that you're waiting 7 minutes than 3 minutes but not knowing. So we know that feedback and communication, those are very low-hanging fruit that we can do, and this is internally and externally. So that's the concept of low-hanging fruit. But when we walk into an organization, mostly when they've been working on Salesforce for a while, we see overwhelm. We see one guy responsible for hundreds of opportunities, some of them with thousands of closed or unclosed activities. What we want to say is, how does that help you do your work? If you walk in the morning, how do you decide what to do? Because you can't do it with this view. You're going to do it based on what's the latest and loudest, and everybody around you is going to learn. If you want him to work, if you want him to work on anything that's important to you, send him a mail or go bother him, and nobody uses the system. So what we start seeing is what we really need is a prioritization assurance mechanism. If you're sitting here right now, that you have the assurance that the guys working for you are doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's what we want. Everything we do is this is partly the true north that we're heading towards. But it feels as if there's a missing puzzle piece, as if some gremlin keeps taking everything. Every one of these efforts that we do just feels like we're swimming through molasses, the change management we're doing around these orgs. And in the time that we've spent, we've seen that there's something bigger going on. And we've started solving that with exceptional results, and that's partly why we want to explain why we're excited about CPQ. So the core versus tangential action analysis. What we do is we start looking at what somebody is supposed to do during their day. Your core activities, for instance, would be just coming to work, getting in your car. If you don't do a core activity, nothing happens. A tangential activity, on the other hand, is something that you have to do in addition to the thing that you're doing. So an example in a car, again, a core activity would be stepping on the brake, which then lights up the brake light versus using your indicator. You have to remember to use your indicator. If you don't remember, it's not going to switch itself on. But you've never forgotten to switch on a brake light because you don't have to remember. It happens naturally as part of the activity. So this is what we look for. Is what are we expecting from these guys, especially the reps? And is it realistic? So the first thing we want them to do is keep your client records accurate and up to date. We want them to record all of your leads in the CRM so that everything goes to one funnel. We want them to plan their activities and log their activities in Salesforce. We want them to upload the quotes in the CRM. We want them to update the opportunity values when they start producing values to say, okay, you knew at the start it didn't have a value, but you just produced the quote. Why is the value still at 0? New opportunities need to be moved to the correct stages, especially if you have a lot of automation that needs to happen. And you need to provide accurate enough information for downstream functions to be able to rely on this. Now, this is the real nub. Because this is where most people struggle, that the CRM intends to, as much as it's possible for it to be the center of truth, it's pushed to the side. If I'm an accountant or somebody in ops and I'm expected to only work on the stuff that comes via the CRM, but not everything is accurate. That's the same as telling you, let's say it's 99% accurate. You get a car, and 99% of the time when you turn the steering wheel, it's going to turn, but only 1% of the time it's not going to do anything at all when you try and turn the steering wheel. Would you get in that car? Nobody would get in that car. But we're expecting them to do this. We're expecting somebody to say, okay, we want you to focus on the CRM and ignore everything else, but not everything is accurate. It's not that they're being obstinate, it's self-preservation. It's them still trying to do their jobs, and it then sometimes feels like it's this immune response that tries to push the organization out of the, or at least Salesforce out of the organization. So if we look at exactly as we said, if we look at those activities and ask, are these core or are they tangential? Every one of these, as we set them up here, are tangential. None of them form part of their normal work. None of them. All of them is something we ask them to do in addition to the work they do. It's not actually phoning a client. It's not actually arriving for work. So this is one of the biggest reasons we see that it's so easy to ignore. It's not even, it's exceptional cases where we see that not happening. And part of the answer about where to fix this, if we ask, how do we fix this? There's one very specific trick that we do. And again, we like quick hacks. For instance, we use a lot of knowledge around systems and a lot of knowledge around people. We have a specific case study for a client who brought down the absenteeism in the company by about 75%. Not by asking for a doctor's letter or anything like that. They only asked, if you're not coming to work today, we want you to take your camera and take a 6-second video telling me I am sick today, I'm not coming to work, and sending it to your boss. 75% down. Because people suddenly were afraid that, oh shit, they're going to see I'm lying. So we like hacks that work, and this is one of those core ones. What we're doing now is we're going to produce a core action in that same chain that was previously a tangential action. We're going to make it a core one. And important about core activities, you can't skip core activities. So CPQ, again, it's a pity we couldn't actually do a demo today, but an exceptionally advanced quoting module to Salesforce. It brings quoting into Salesforce. It's the market leader at this stage in terms of its functionality. You use it specifically in circumstances where you want to control the pricing, you want to control the discounts, you want to control what products people sell together. All of that is built within the logic of Salesforce CPQ. It's mobile ready. So everybody's so focused on what the effect is on the salesman to say you're going to quote so much faster. It's just going to look wonderful. At the end of the process, it prints out a beautifully formatted document. All of that's true. And it really is very nice, but that's not the reason we're excited about it. The reason we're excited about it is if we bring CPQ in, it starts changing the way we manage teams. So again, as Conway indicated as well, we've seen a major correlation in companies that are able to quote faster, that close more deals. Even when you monitor your own data, if you've got the data available, look at when the lead came in, when the quote went out, and look at the closing ratios between those that are fast and those that are slow. We also know, because often we're responsible for managing sales teams. If the sales teams don't function, if we can't see an increase in sales in the organizations we work, we failed. And that was the agreement we make with the clients at the start of the process. So we know, as a trick, that even if your conversion rate stays absolutely flat, if you produce more quotes, you produce more sales. That's it. It's a scientific certainty that we generally are able to control within the teams to say, what can we do, what activities can we do to make your reps able to do more quotes. If somebody says, but he can't do it, he just doesn't have time, then we know, remove the parts that affect his ability to do more quotes. And what we're very excited about is you as a manager, your management style is dramatically different in a CPQ-enabled org than without it. So what happens in our chain when we add CPQ? So remember, that previous instruction was upload the quote. All we're going to do now is we're going to say we're going to produce this quote in the CPQ. Just one word difference. The key thing for anybody that knows Salesforce here is you can't produce a quote without an opportunity. You just can't. It always asks you what's the opportunity. And since your directive was if we catch anybody producing a quote anywhere else, you'll be fired. That's all you have to say. What immediately happens is the downstream effects or the upstream effects. That's the first one. The second one is you can start pushing some of these KPI activities to say, well, I'm not seeing an accurate record. I can enforce certain data standards that previously guys didn't use to say I want this minimum info on account before it's allowed. So what starts happening is that you start enforcing all of your data standards and your records in time organically start getting richer and richer and richer without it ever being this one massive cleanup exercise. Your downstream effects is for the first time your opportunity pipeline is 100% accurate because nobody had to remember to update anything. All of the opportunity values are based on what's happening in the quotes on those products and those totals. which means that we, with a lot more confidence, can start automating certain actions, especially for the downstream functions. For the first time, the administrators of SAP and the other ERPs we have to integrate to are more comfortable saying, we will allow Salesforce to be the primary instance, because they're terrified of thinking they have to accept the price that comes from Salesforce. Now, it's not so bad anymore because they can trust the data that's in Salesforce is going to be more accurate than the ERP. And this is the reason we were so excited about getting involved with CPQ specifically, because of the effect that we see in the organizations that adopt it well. And one of the nicest things we do, it simplifies the management of any staff member who's working on CPQ. And we just look at 3 things when we try and manage guys on the CPQ. The first is we look at quoting related metrics. We want to look at how many quotes you produce, what's the size variance between your quotes, discount variance, product variance, closing ratios. We look at the differences between staff on those, and it helps us say precisely this is what this guy needs to focus on, this is what this guy needs to focus on. And CPQ, again, for new staff, you can use so much of the guided selling, of the product bundles that we set up in order to make that faster, so we can really focus on the metrics that affect sales. The second thing is we look at specifically the crucial episodes that relate to quoting. Lead to quote, exceptionally important. And then your turnaround quote time for the quote itself. So that's the second horizon we manage on. And the third one, and this is something we do for all, whether there's CPQ attached or not, there's the one thing we look for, does every opportunity have one next action that's future dated? Every single opportunity must have one future action. So when you finish that action, immediately you're forced to think about what the next one is. Otherwise, it's just going to get lost. Because again, what we want to do is when you log in the morning, it doesn't need to be noise. It needs to be relevant for the work that you're doing that day. And this is one of the easiest ways to enable that. So we know that if you achieve high scores, if we were to score your organization after a while on these 3, and you achieve high scores, it's a statistical certainty that your sales increase. And that's one of the tricks we use to increase sales in organizations. It's actually not that tricky. So it doesn't replace you as a driver. CPQ can't replace you as a driver. You still have to manage very carefully, but it does make the game a lot more winnable. So thank you.